Clara had nothing, no home, no family. Yet when she saw two grown thugs shove Lily to the ground, she didn't hesitate. They beat her till she was barely breathing, but she still stood between them and her. When Dante, the feared Chicago Mafia boss, heard an invisible street girl took a beating protecting his daughter, the streets went silent. That night, engines roared through the city. Clara opened her eyes to blinding headlights and heavy footsteps closing in. Dante stepped forward, voice low and dangerous. "Who touched my girl?" Then came the shock no one expected. He did not look at Clara with disgust, nor did he blame the bruised, shivering street girl bleeding on the wet concrete. Instead, Dante turned his slow, terrifying gaze toward the two men cowering in the narrow alleyway. The taller thug stammered a frantic plea, stepping back until his spine hit the wet brick wall, but the desperate words died in his throat as Dante moved. There was no shouting, no chaotic frenzy of fists, only a cold and calculated destruction. Dante closed the distance with predatory grace, and the sound of breaking bone echoed sharply through the freezing rain, followed by a heavy, breathless thud as the first man dropped. Clara squeezed her swollen eyes shut, her fractured ribs screaming with every ragged gasp she drew, bracing herself for the inevitable moment when the monster of Chicago would turn his merciless wrath upon her. She was just street trash, a disposable shadow wrapped in a threadbare, oversized sweater, completely unworthy of breathing the same air as the immaculate man. Towering over the blood-stained alley. Her taped shoes were soaked with freezing slush, and she knew exactly how the world treated girls like her. But the heavy boots did not step over her body to leave her to rot in the winter storm. They stopped right beside her face. Clara peeled one eye open, trembling violently as the imposing figure knelt down, utterly ignoring the grime and filth ruining the knees of his charcoal suit. Dante reached out, his massive, calloused hands sliding gently under her shoulders and knees. "Please," Clara choked out, the single word tasting like copper and ash on her split lips. "I did not hurt her." "I know," Dante murmured, his voice a deep, gravelly rumble that vibrated through her shattered chest and settled deep in her weary bones. "You saved her." With effortless strength, he lifted her from the icy ground. Clara gasped in shock, her dizzy head falling against a chest as solid as stone, her fading senses instantly overwhelmed by the rich scent of expensive cedar, dark espresso, and the faint, metallic tang of gunpowder. She fully expected to be tossed into the back of a sterile ambulance or dumped outside the doors of a free charity clinic, but Dante carried her straight toward his idling motorcade. The winter rain slashed mercilessly at them, but Clara barely felt the biting cold anymore, entirely shielded by the sheer, enveloping warmth radiating from the dangerous man holding her. A heavy armored door swung open, and he settled her with surprising tenderness onto the plush, heated leather of a massive vehicle. The stark contrast was dizzying, and almost painful to her bruised mind. For months, her entire reality had consisted of sharp winds, damp cardboard boxes, and the constant, gnawing hollow of deep starvation. Now, she was sinking into a world of absolute, untouchable luxury, the pristine leather smooth against her raw, scraped hands. Little Lily scrambled into the spacious seat beside her, tears leaving clean tracks through the dirt on her pale face, her tiny fingers latching onto Clara's torn sleeve with a desperate, unyielding grip. Dante slid in right next to them, taking up all the air in the dark cabin as the heavy doors sealed shut with a pressurized thud, locking the violent freezing storm firmly outside. "Drive," Dante commanded the silent man behind the steering wheel. "And call the estate. Tell the doctor if she stops breathing, I will hold him personally responsible." The powerful engine purred to life, smooth and completely silent, carrying them rapidly away from the forgotten alley where Clara had fully expected to take her final breath. She stared blankly at the dark velvet ceiling of the car, her vision blurring heavily at the edges as she fought the thick fog of exhaustion pulling her under. She had spent her entire 22 years of life being utterly invisible, a discarded ghost haunting the filthy corners of a city that simply did not care if she lived or starved. Yet here, Bleeding into the custom interior of a Mafia king's fortress on wheels, she had suddenly become the absolute center of gravity. Dante kept his dark, intense eyes locked on her fading face, stripping away the impenetrable mask of a ruthless underworld boss to reveal the fierce, desperate gratitude of a father who had almost lost his world. He did not pull away from the foul street grime coating her clothes, nor did he wipe away the dark blood she left smeared across his pristine white cuffs. Clara wanted to ask where they were going, wanted to quietly apologize for ruining his beautiful car, but the broken words dissolved into a soft, silent sigh. As the rhythmic, steady motion of the tires lulled her fading consciousness, the agonizing pain in her shattered ribs began to slip away, replaced by a warm, heavy darkness. For the very first time since she was a little girl, surrounded by heavily armed men and the absolute most dangerous predator in all of Chicago, Clara closed her eyes and felt completely, undeniably safe. Clara woke to the sensation of falling, but instead of the harsh, frozen concrete of the Chicago streets, her bruised body was suspended in a cloud of spun sugar and lavender. She tried to drag a breath into her lungs, but a sharp, biting agony flared across her ribs, forcing a small whimper from her cracked lips. Her trembling fingers moved instinctively to her torso, tracing the thick, pristine white medical bandages wrapped tightly around her skin. The abrasive, freezing dampness of the alleyway was gone, replaced by the suffocating weight of silk sheets that felt like cool water gliding over her battered limbs. Slowly, she forced her swollen eyes open, blinking against the muted, golden light filtering through heavy velvet curtains. The room was vast and terrifyingly beautiful. Adorned with intricate plaster moldings on the ceiling and rich mahogany furniture that gleamed with old money and quiet menace. This was not the back room of a charity clinic, nor was it the cramped, drafty storage closet where she usually unrolled her sleeping bag after a grueling 14-hour shift peeling potatoes as an invisible street chef. This was a sprawling, impenetrable fortress, a gilded cage built on blood and secrets, and she was buried right in the center of its terrifying wealth. She frantically searched the plush, hand-woven carpet for her torn jacket and her worn-out sneakers, the ones she diligently wrapped in silver duct tape every morning to keep the winter slush from freezing her toes, but they were completely gone. The sheer, overwhelming contrast between her world of desperate poverty and this room of absolute power made her throat constrict with a sudden, suffocating panic. Before she could push herself up from the massive bed, the heavy brass handle of the bedroom door clicked with a deafening finality. The air pressure in the room immediately dropped, turning cold and heavy as Dominic Vance stepped over the threshold. He did not walk, he simply conquered the space, his tall, broad-shouldered silhouette blotting out the light from the hallway. His expensive, midnight black suit absorbed the shadows, and every measured footfall was completely silent against the thick rug. He carried the dizzying scent of dark espresso, expensive cedar, and the faint, metallic tang of recently fired weapons. Dominic stopped at the foot of her mattress, casting a long, intimidating shadow that completely swallowed her fragile, trembling frame. He did not look at her with an ounce of pity or warmth. Instead, his dark, fathomless eyes pierced right through her defenses with cold, calculated suspicion. "You are awake," Dominic stated, his voice a low, freezing rumble that vibrated through the floorboards and settled deep in her aching bones. Clara shrank back against the mountain of fluffy pillows, her heart hammering violently against her freshly bandaged ribs. "Where am I?" she whispered, the words scraping painfully against her raw, dry throat. "You are inside my estate," he replied smoothly, leaning slightly forward to rest his large, calloused hands on the carved wooden footboard. "But the real question is why you are here, Clara Hayes." The sound of her full name falling from his lips sent a jolt of pure terror straight down her spine. A man like him did not just ask questions, he already knew all the answers. "I had my security team look into your life while the doctor was pulling glass out of your back," Dominic continued, his tone dripping with dark, measured scrutiny. "You have exactly $14.32 to your name. You sleep behind the dumpsters of a diner. You tape the soles of your shoes to survive the winter. You are a ghost, a girl who has spent her entire 22 years of life learning exactly how to stay invisible so the world does not crush you." He tilted his head, his piercing gaze stripping away every pathetic secret she had ever tried to hide. "So tell me, Clara, why does a starving, invisible street girl throw her broken body in front of two grown, violent men to protect a little girl she does not even know?" Clara stared at him, utterly overwhelmed by the sheer gravity of his presence. His world was one of absolute, unyielding power, built on violence, wealth, and control, while hers was a fragile house of cards held together by nothing but hunger and sheer desperation. "She was crying," Clara answered, her voice trembling but refusing to break under his intimidating stare. "They were hurting her, and no one else in the entire city was stopping them." Dominic narrowed his eyes, the heavy, suffocating silence stretching out between them like a taut wire ready to snap. In his dark, treacherous underworld, nobody did anything for free. Every favor had a steep price, every act of protection was a calculated transaction, and kindness was nothing but a myth for the weak. He examined her pale, sunken cheeks, the dark, exhausted circles bruising the delicate skin under her eyes, and the defiant, warm spark burning dimly within her tired gaze. He fully expected a lie, a desperate plea for a cash reward, or a manipulative sob story about her miserable, empty life. Instead, she gave him nothing but the raw, unpolished, beautiful truth. "You could have died," he pointed out, the freezing, dangerous edge of his voice softening by a fraction of a degree as he stared at her small hands. "I die a little bit every single day out there on the streets," Clara murmured, looking down at the pristine white sheets covering her lap. "At least yesterday, I actually mattered." Dominic went completely still, the profound weight of her melancholic words settling over him like a heavy, velvet shroud. He looked at this fragile, battered girl wrapped in his expensive silk, a girl who had absolutely nothing but was willing to give up her own life for a child, and for the very first time in his ruthless, violent existence, the most feared mafia boss in Chicago did not know what to say. The heavy silence stretched between them, thick with the scent of Dominic Van Cess's expensive cologne and the lingering metallic tang of the violence he commanded. Clara Hayes stared at the impossibly pristine white blanket covering her lap, her bruised fingers nervously tracing the delicate silk threads. She felt completely exposed beneath his dark, penetrating gaze, a stray alley cat trapped in a cage made of pure gold. Dominic leaned back slightly, the leather of his chair creaking with the subtle shift of his massive frame. He did not look at her with pity, which was a mercy she had not expected from a man who ruled Chicago's bloody underworld. Instead, he observed her with the cold, calculating precision of a predator measuring the exact worth of a newly discovered asset. "You have nothing out there," Dominic stated, his voice a low, gravelly rumble that seemed to vibrate through the very floorboards and settle deep in her aching chest. "No family to notice you are missing, no safe place to lay your head, no future waiting for you on those freezing streets." The absolute truth of his words hit her like a physical blow, stealing the fragile air from her lungs. Clara closed her swollen eyes, the phantom sting of the bitter winter wind suddenly biting at her skin despite the overwhelming warmth of the luxurious bedroom. She thought of her cramped, damp corner behind the diner dumpsters, the hollow ache of starvation that kept her awake for 3 days straight, and the taped soles of her only pair of shoes that did nothing to stop the icy slush. She was a ghost, entirely invisible to a city that walked right past her misery every single day. But this terrifying mafia boss had stopped. He had carried her bleeding body out of the rain, wrapped her in silk, and demanded her name. "I survived just fine before I met you," Clara whispered, the lie tasting like ash on her cracked lips. Dominic tilted his head, a dark, humorless smile touching the corner of his mouth. "Survival is not living, Clara. It is merely waiting to die." He stood up, his towering silhouette casting a long, intimidating shadow across her bed, completely swallowing the weak morning light filtering through the velvet curtains. He moved closer, each step deliberate and silent, until he was standing right beside her mattress. Clara flinched instinctively, her breath hitching in her bruised ribs. fully expecting the harsh reality of male cruelty she had known all her 22 years. But Dominic did not raise his hand in anger. Instead, he reached into the inner pocket of his immaculate, custom-tailored suit jacket and pulled out a heavy, gleaming gold coin, tossing it onto the mattress near her trembling hand. "I am a man who honors his ledgers," Dominic said softly, his dark eyes burning into her soul. "My family built its empire on a very simple rule. We never forget a betrayal, and we never leave a debt unpaid. You stepped in front of a brutal beating meant for my daughter. You bled for my blood." He leaned down, his face hovering mere inches from hers, the sheer, suffocating gravity of his presence making her heart race wildly against her broken ribs. "You are not going back to the streets, Clara Hayes. You are staying right here." Clara gasped, her wide, terrified eyes locking onto his intense gaze. "I cannot stay here," she stammered, panic fluttering in her raw throat like a trapped bird. "I do not belong in a place like this. I do not belong in your world." "My world is dangerous," Dominic agreed without a single trace of hesitation, his honesty cutting through the air like a sharpened blade. "But my world protects what belongs to it. Out there, the winter will freeze you, the hunger will hollow you out, and the city will step over your body without a second thought. In here, you will never feel the cold again. You will never starve. And no one in Chicago will ever dare to lay a hand on you." He pointed a large, calloused finger at the heavy mahogany door. "My daughter Lily needs someone. She does not need another stiff, terrified nanny who looks at me with pure horror. She needs someone who understands what it means to be absolutely terrified, yet still refuses to back down. She needs a protector." Clara stared at the gleaming gold coin resting on the pristine white sheets, the symbol of an inescapable bond tying her to a world of shadows, blood, and secrets. She was profoundly terrified of Dominic Vance, terrified of the lethal power he wielded so casually, and terrified of the violent monsters that lurked just outside these high stone walls. But when she thought of the bitter, biting snow waiting for her beyond the estate gates, she knew he was entirely right. The streets offered nothing but a slow, agonizing death. She thought of Lily, the fragile, trembling child who had clutched her torn sleeve in the armored car, a wealthy girl who somehow carried the exact same lonely, haunted look Clara saw in the mirror every day. Taking a deep, ragged breath that burned her healing ribs, Clara slowly reached out and closed her bruised fingers around the cold, heavy gold coin. "I will stay for Lily," she whispered, her voice barely carrying over the quiet hum of the massive house. Dominic stared at her small, battered hand, a flash of something dark, possessive, and fiercely protective igniting deep within his black eyes. "You will stay for Lily," he echoed softly, his voice a low, binding promise that seemed to lock the golden cage firmly around them both. "But make no mistake, Clara. You are under my protection now. And I never let what is mine slip away." The sprawling estate of Dominic Vance was an impenetrable fortress built of cold white marble and suffocating silence. For 3 agonizing days, Clara Hayes had wandered the cavernous halls like a phantom, her ribs tightly bound beneath the oversized cashmere sweaters Rosa, the strict housekeeper, had provided. Every hesitant footstep she took echoed against the vaulted ceilings, bouncing off gilded picture frames and statues that cost more than a lifetime of wages at the greasy street corner diner where she used to cook. Dozens of bodyguards in tailored black suits stood at every intersection like stone gargoyles, their massive hands hovering near hidden holsters. They never spoke a single word. The uniformed maids wiped down antique tables with perfectly measured strokes, their eyes always glued firmly to the polished floors in absolute terror. It was a house entirely devoid of warmth, a glittering museum where even the oxygen felt too expensive and dangerous to breathe. But the most haunting part of the estate was not the armed men or the terrifying boss who ruled them with an iron fist. It was the tiny, dark-haired ghost who floated through the corridors completely unnoticed. Lily Vance was 7 years old, but she moved with the devastating caution of a child who had learned that taking up space was a punishable offense. Clara watched her from the deep shadows of the grand staircase one rainy Tuesday morning. The little girl was sitting on the icy marble floor of the sunroom, her knees pulled tight to her chest, frantically trying to string a collection of wooden beads onto a thick blue thread. The thread kept fraying, the beads kept slipping, and Lily kept failing. Her small face pinched in quiet, desperate frustration. A maid walked right past her, carrying a tray of fresh towels, not even glancing downward at the struggling child. A massive guard stationed by the glass doors kept his eyes locked on the perimeter, treating the billionaire child like a piece of invisible furniture. Clara felt a familiar, agonizing ache twist deep in her chest. She recognized that specific, hollow brand of loneliness. It was the exact same bitter isolation she had endured her entire life, screaming into a dark void that simply refused to listen. She knew the crushing weight of being small and forgotten by a cruel world. Ignoring the sharp twinge in her healing ribs, Clara stepped out of the shadows and crossed the vast, intimidating room. She did not hover over the child like a towering authority figure. Instead, she lowered herself to the freezing marble floor, crossing her legs until she was exactly at Lily eye level. The little girl flinched violently, dropping the wooden beads, her wide brown eyes darting up in absolute terror. Clara did not reach out to touch her. She knew better than to trap a frightened animal. Instead, she gently picked up the frayed blue thread and the scattered beads. She took a slow, deep breath, reaching back into the dark corners of her own tragic past. When she was a teenager, hiding in the neglected back rooms of the city foster system, she had shared a cramped bunk with a deaf girl who had taught her how to speak with her hands. It was a beautiful language born of pure silence, and right now, silence was the only language Lily seemed to know. Clara raised her hands, keeping her movements slow and incredibly gentle. "Hello," she signed, her fingers forming the shape with practiced ease. "My name is Clara. Would you like some help with this?" Lily stopped breathing. The little girl stared at Clara's hands, her dark eyes widening to the size of saucers, completely stunned by the silent words. For 10 agonizing seconds, the grand sunroom was dead silent, save for the rhythmic patter of rain against the floor-to-ceiling windows. Clara held her breath, terrified she had pushed too hard, terrified she had broken the fragile peace of the traumatized child. But then, Lily's tiny, trembling hands lifted into the cold air. "You know how to talk like me," the little girl signed back, her movements clumsy but unmistakably clear. Clara felt a massive lump form in her raw throat. She smiled, a soft, genuine expression that reached all the way to her tired, bruised eyes. "Yes," Clara signed back, tapping her chest. "I do. I can help you." Lily stared at her for one more heartbeat before a beautiful, radiant smile broke across her small face, illuminating the gloomy room like a sudden burst of sunlight. She scooted a few inches closer, offering the wooden beads to the bruised street chef who had suddenly opened up her world. Neither of them knew that they were being watched. Standing perfectly still in the shadowed doorway of the sunroom, Dominic Vance felt as though a sniper bullet had just pierced his chest. The ruthless Mafia king of Chicago, a man who had burned through millions of dollars and threatened the greatest medical specialists in the country to find a cure for his daughter's trauma-induced muteness, was utterly paralyzed. He stood frozen, gripping the heavy wooden doorframe until his knuckles turned bone white. He watched the broken, starving girl from the alleyway sit on his cold floor and do the one impossible thing he had failed to do for 3 agonizing years. He watched her bring his daughter back to life. Dominic's dark eyes locked onto Clara's soft profile, tracing the gentle curve of her smile and the fluid, graceful movements of her hands. He had brought her into his fortress to repay a debt of blood, fully expecting her to cower in a corner or demand a massive payout. But instead, she had simply knelt down and breathed pure warmth into the coldest, deadest parts of his home. A fierce, terrifying possessiveness flared deep in his chest, burning away every last ounce of logic and caution he possessed. She was not just a dead anymore. She was the missing heartbeat of his fractured family. And as Dominic watched his little girl laugh silently with the woman who had bled for her, he knew with absolute, terrifying certainty that he would slaughter anyone who ever tried to take Clara Hayes away from them. The heavy iron gates of the Vance estate loomed like a gilded cage, keeping the freezing Chicago winter firmly on the outside while Clara stood shivering on the manicured lawn. 3 weeks had passed since she was pulled from the blood-stained alley, yet she still felt like a feral street cat trapped in a palace of white marble in suffocating silence. She clutched the oversized cashmere sweater tightly around her healing ribs, her taped sneakers shifting uneasily against the pristine cobblestone path near the perimeter fence. She was just beginning to let her guard down, just starting to believe the gnawing hollow of starvation was a ghost of the past, when a harsh, grating voice shattered the quiet afternoon. "Well, look who finally hit the jackpot." The crude words made Clara freeze, her blood turning to ice as she turned toward the wrought iron bars. Standing on the other side of the gate, smelling faintly of stale beer and cheap cigars, was Gary. He was the ruthless, heavy-set slumlord who had thrown her out into the freezing slush 2 months ago when she was just $4 short on her rent for a damp, roach-infested basement room. He gripped the metal bars, his bloodshot eyes sweeping over the lavish estate with greedy, predatory hunger. "I heard a rumor you got scooped up by some rich mark," Gary sneered, his breath pluming in the freezing air. "Which means you finally have the money you owe me, you little thief." Clara took a trembling step back, the familiar, suffocating panic rising in her raw throat. She was instantly transported back to the damp, freezing darkness of that basement, where she had begged him for just one more day, only for him to toss her meager belongings into the street. "I do not owe you anything," Clara whispered, her voice barely carrying over the biting wind. "You kept my deposit. Leave me alone." But Gary did not leave. Before the perimeter guards could completely close the distance, he reached his thick, greasy hand through the iron bars and clamped his thick fingers brutally around Clara's fragile, bruised wrist. Clara gasped in sudden agony, her knees buckling as he yanked her forward, his nails digging directly into the purple and yellow flesh where the thugs had grabbed her weeks ago. "You owe me for 6 months of back rent," Gary hissed, his face pressed against the cold metal. "And you are going to pay me, or I will. Tell the cops exactly what kind of trash this rich guy is harboring." High above the courtyard, standing on the master balcony overlooking the manicured grounds, Dominic Vance was smoking a cigarette. His dark, impenetrable eyes had been tracking Clara's small, fragile silhouette as she wandered near the gates, watching the way she still folded herself inward to take up as little space as possible. When he saw the filthy stranger grab her wrist, the cigarette snapped in half between his fingers. The air around the Mafia boss went absolutely dead. There was no chaotic shouting, no frantic scramble. Dominic moved with the cold, lethal precision of a predator closing in on its prey. By the time Clara squeezed her swollen eyes shut, bracing for the inevitable violence she had endured her entire life, the temperature in the courtyard seemed to plummet to absolute zero. A shadow blotted out the pale winter sun. Dominic stepped up behind Clara, his massive chest brushing against her trembling back, his sheer, overwhelming presence radiating a terrifying, dark heat. He did not look at Clara, nor did he yell at the sweating slumlord. Instead, Dominic reached out with one large, calloused hand and clamped it directly over Gary's thick wrist. "Let go of her," Dominic commanded, his voice a low, gravelly whisper that vibrated with the promise of absolute destruction. Gary sneered, trying to pull his arm back, completely oblivious to the monster standing before him. "Who the hell are you? This little rat owes me." The sentence died in Gary's throat with a sickening, wet crunch. Dominic simply twisted his wrist, applying a fraction of his terrifying strength, and the sound of breaking bone echoed sharply across the quiet courtyard. Gary shrieked in sudden, blinding agony, instantly releasing Clara as he dropped to his knees on the other side of the gate, clutching his shattered wrist against his chest. Clara stumbled backward, her breath hitching in her bruised ribs, but Dominic caught her effortlessly, pulling her small, shaking frame against his pristine, charcoal suit. He completely ignored the whimpering man bleeding into the snow and stared down at him with eyes as dark and empty as a midnight ocean. You have exactly 5 seconds to drag yourself away from my property, Dominic murmured, the soft, lethal words slicing through the freezing wind like a razor. If I ever see your face in this city again, if I ever even hear that you breathed her name, I will not just break your bones. I will erase you from the earth. Gary scrambled backward through the freezing slush, his face entirely drained of color, his greedy eyes wide with absolute, primal terror as he finally realized exactly whose cage he had just rattled. He turned and ran, slipping and falling into the snow, leaving a trail of dark blood behind him. Clara squeezed her eyes shut, trembling violently against Dominic's solid chest, waiting for him to turn his terrible wrath upon her for bringing street trash to his immaculate door. She was a ghost, a disposable burden who only brought trouble. But Dominic did not push her away in disgust. He slowly turned her around, his massive hands reaching out to gently cradle her bruised wrist. He traced the angry, dark purple marks with a touch so impossibly tender it made her heart stutter against her ribs. He looked down at her pale, tear-streaked face, stripping away the cold mask of a ruthless underworld king to reveal a fierce, all-consuming protectiveness. No one will ever hurt you again, Dominic promised, his deep voice wrapping around her battered soul like a heavy, velvet shield. You belong to me now, Clara. And my monsters only hunt for you. The morning after the terrifying encounter at the gates, Clara woke to find her frayed, duct-taped sneakers and her thin, stained jacket entirely gone from her pristine bedroom. In their place, draped carefully across the foot of her massive silk bed, lay garments of such impossible luxury that she was almost too afraid to touch them. There were thick cashmere sweaters in soft creams and deep charcoals, silk blouses that felt like liquid against her battered skin, and leather boots lined with warm fleece that cost more than she had ever earned in a year of peeling potatoes at the greasy diner. When she cautiously made her way down the grand, echoing marble staircase, the gnawing, acidic hollow of starvation that had defined her entire existence was banished by the overwhelming scent of roasted meats, fresh pastries, and rich espresso. Rosa, the stern housekeeper, piled Clara plate high with delicate pastries, fresh fruit, and heavy, cream-soaked eggs, watching with a softening gaze as the fragile street chef ate until her bruised ribs actually ached from being full. It was a dizzying, surreal transition. Only weeks ago, her reality consisted of sharp winds, damp cardboard boxes, and begging for scraps behind the kitchen doors of the city's worst restaurants. Now, she was sinking into a world of absolute, untouchable luxury, shielded from the cruel winter by thick stone walls and an army of silent men. But it was not just the overwhelming, untouchable wealth of the estate that began to wrap around Clara like a velvet cage. It was the heavy, inescapable presence of Dominic Vance. The feared Chicago Mafia boss was suddenly everywhere, shedding the impenetrable armor of his ruthless underworld empire the moment he stepped through the heavy oak doors of the mansion. He would stand perfectly still in the shadowed archways of the sunroom, his hands casually tucked into the pockets of his immaculate, custom-tailored suits, watching Clara sit on the icy floor with little Lily. Clara would patiently teach the traumatized, silent child new signs, their fingers dancing together in the quiet morning light, and she could always feel Dominic's dark, intense eyes burning into her skin. His gaze was no longer just suspicious or evaluating, the way it had been when he first brought her into his home. It had shifted into a dark, consuming hunger, a primal fascination that made the tiny hairs on the back of her neck stand up in alarm. He watched the way she carefully braided his daughter's dark hair, completely ignoring her own lingering pain. He watched the fierce, unbroken spirit shining in her blue-gray eyes, a quiet, desperate defiance that simply refused to be crushed by the immense power of the men surrounding her. The strict, professional lines between a hired protector and a billionaire employer began to blur and dissolve into the heated, pressurized air of the estate. Clara found herself looking for him, her heart skipping a beat whenever she caught the faint, masculine scent of his cologne lingering in the grand hallways. One evening, after the sprawling mansion had fallen into a deep, oppressive silence, Clara stood alone in the magnificent library, gently running her fingers over the gold-embossed spines of ancient books. She wore a simple, fitted black dress from her new wardrobe, the soft fabric clinging perfectly to her small frame, finally replacing the baggy, threadbare layers she used to hide inside. She did not hear his heavy footsteps approach. She only felt the sudden, terrifying drop in the room temperature, followed by the intoxicating scent of gunpowder, dark espresso, and expensive cedar. Dominic stepped into the dim, golden light of the roaring fireplace, completely trapping her against the towering mahogany bookshelves. He reached out, his massive, calloused fingers brushing a stray lock of brown hair behind her ear. His touch was shockingly gentle, tracing the delicate curve of her jawline, completely at odds with the violent, destructive monster who ruled the dark city streets. "You look beautiful," Dominic murmured, his voice a low, gravelly vibration that sent a violent shiver cascading down her spine. Clara swallowed hard, her heart hammering wildly against her ribs, entirely paralyzed by his sheer, overwhelming proximity. "You bought these clothes," she whispered, her voice barely a trembling breath. "You bought all of it, the food, the safety. I have absolutely no way to ever repay you." Dominic stepped even closer, completely invading her personal space, his dark, fathomless eyes locking onto hers with a fierce, possessive intensity that stole the air right out of her lungs. "I do not want your repayment, Clara," he said, leaning down until his lips were mere inches from hers, his hot breath ghosting across her trembling mouth. "I want you to understand exactly where you belong. Out there, you were a disposable ghost freezing in the slush, completely ignored by a world that did not deserve you. In here, you are the absolute center of my gravity. You brought my daughter back to me, and you brought light into a fortress that has been dead and empty for 3 agonizing years." He slid his rough palm down to cup her warm cheek, tilting her face up to meet his dark, burning gaze, claiming her without a single physical restraint. "You are under my protection now. You are mine to clothe, mine to feed, and mine to keep safe. The streets will never touch you again. I will burn this entire city to the ground before I ever let you walk back into the cold." Clara stared up at the ruthless Mafia king, her pulse deafening in her ears, realizing with a terrifying, undeniable thrill that the invisible street girl had not just found a safe haven. She had become the singular, irreplaceable obsession of the most dangerous predator in Chicago, and he had absolutely no intention of ever letting her go. The sprawling Chicago estate was a fortress of pristine marble and towering glass, but Clara Hayes knew better than anyone that no cage was truly impenetrable. Her 22 years on the brutal, freezing streets had permanently rewired her nervous system, turning her into a hyper-aware ghost who noticed every shifting shadow. It started on a gloomy Thursday afternoon, as the bitter winter wind howled against the heavy reinforced windows. Clara was sitting on the thick Persian rug in the sunroom, patiently guiding little Lily through a new set of sign language gestures. The traumatized child offered a fragile, breathtaking smile, her small fingers eagerly mimicking Clara's movements. But Clara felt a sudden, icy prickle crawl up the back of her neck, the exact same primal warning that used to save her from violent thugs in the city alleys. She subtly shifted her gaze toward the grand hallway. A newly hired maintenance man, dressed in a crisp gray uniform, was lingering far too long near the heavy service doors leading to the eastern gardens. He was not polishing the brass fixtures or checking the security keypads. He was deliberately wedging a small, folded piece of thick cardboard into the lock mechanism, ensuring the reinforced steel door would not seal completely. Clara felt her blood run cold, the terrifying realization dropping like a stone in her stomach. Dominic Vance, the ruthless Mafia king who had wrapped her in pure cashmere and absolute safety, had powerful enemies. A rival Chicago crime syndicate had clearly realized that the untouchable predator finally had a weakness, a quiet street girl and a mute daughter. Clara did not scream. Screaming on the streets only attracted more monsters. Instead, she smoothly stood up, her bruised ribs protesting the sudden movement, and calmly pulled Lily behind her legs. "Stay right behind me," Clara signed, her trembling hands moving with desperate speed. "Do not make a single sound." Lily's brown eyes widened in pure terror, but the little girl obeyed instantly, clutching the back of Clara's thick sweater. 3 heavily armed men dressed in dark tactical gear slipped through the compromised service door, their boots completely silent against the marble floor. They moved with lethal precision, their suppressed weapons raised, heading straight toward the sunroom where the billionaire's daughter sat unprotected. The mole in the gray uniform pointed a trembling finger directly at Clara and the child before turning to flee, but he never made it to the gates. Clara moved with the explosive, desperate ferocity of a cornered alley cat. She grabbed a heavy, solid bronze bookend from a nearby console table, her knuckles turning bone white around the cold metal. The first armed intruder stepped through the glass archway, his dark eyes locking onto Lily with a cruel, victorious gleam. He completely ignored the fragile woman in the oversized sweater, assuming she was just another terrified, helpless maid. That was his fatal mistake. Clara swung the heavy bronze statue with every ounce of terrifying survival instinct she possessed, smashing it directly into the man's kneecap with a sickening crunch. He collapsed. With a muffled shriek, his weapon clattering wildly across the polished floor. Clara did not hesitate. She kicked the heavy gun far out of reach, shoved the bleeding man backward to trip the second intruder, and grabbed Lily into her arms. She sprinted toward the narrow panic corridor tucked behind the grand library, her heart hammering a frantic rhythm against her ribs. The third attacker lunged forward, his heavy hands grasping the collar of Clara's sweater, violently yanking her backward. Clara spun around, shielding Lily entirely with her own body, and drove her elbow sharply into the attacker's throat. He gagged, his grip loosening just enough for Clara to shove Lily behind a massive oak bookcase. "I will kill you first," the man hissed, recovering his breath and raising his weapon. Directly at Clara's face. She stood absolutely still, her blue-gray eyes burning with unyielding, fierce defiance, perfectly ready to take a bullet for the little girl shivering behind her. But the gunshot never came. A deafening, thunderous roar echoed through the mansion as Dominic Vance materialized from the shadows like the devil himself. The Mafia boss did not use a weapon. He crossed the vast room with terrifying, predatory grace and slammed his massive fist into the attacker's skull, shattering bone and instantly dropping the man to the floor. The remaining intruders tried to raise their guns, but Dominic's elite security team flooded the room, neutralizing the threat in a matter of seconds. The sprawling estate fell into a heavy, metallic silence, broken only by the smell of copper. And the sound of Dominic's ragged breathing. His expensive charcoal suit was ruffled, his dark eyes blazing with a feral, terrifying wrath. He stepped over the bleeding men, completely ignoring the carnage, and dropped to his knees right in front of Clara. His large, shaking hands reached out, hovering over her pale face as if checking to see if she was an illusion. "You did not run," Dominic whispered, his deep, gravelly voice cracking with an emotion so raw and overwhelming it stole Clara's breath. "You stayed and you fought for my blood." Clara trembled violently, her adrenaline finally crashing as she looked at the ruthless monster who had just torn men apart with his bare hands to keep her safe. "She is my family too," Clara murmured, her voice barely a breath. Dominic stared at her, the dark, protective fire in his eyes burning hotter than the sun, realizing that the broken street girl had just cemented her place at the absolute center of his dark, dangerous world. The heavy oak doors of the grand library clicked shut, sealing out the chaotic aftermath of the breach, but Clara could not stop her hands from trembling violently. She sat curled into a tight ball on the edge of a massive velvet sofa, the darkness of the cavernous room pressing against her bruised ribs. The metallic scent of blood and gunpowder still clung to her new clothes, a harsh reminder of the violent world that had just bled into her fragile sanctuary. For 22 years, she had survived the freezing, brutal streets by making herself invisible, yet tonight she had thrown herself in front of a loaded gun for a little girl she barely knew. Her breath hitched in her raw throat, her heart hammering a frantic, terrifying rhythm against her chest as the adrenaline finally crashed. She did not hear the soft, deliberate footsteps approaching until the faint clinking of crystal glass pierced the suffocating silence. A warm, golden glow flickered to life as a single desk lamp was switched on, casting long shadows across the floor to ceiling bookshelves. Dominic stepped into the dim circle of light, looking completely different from the ruthless, feral predator who had just shattered men with his bare hands. He had shed his ruined suit jacket, his crisp white shirt stained with dark crimson patches, the sleeves rolled up to reveal thick, corded forearms covered in fading scars. The terrifying Mafia king of Chicago did not demand answers or issue cold commands. Instead, he moved with a slow, exhausted grace, carrying 2 heavy crystal tumblers filled with amber whiskey. He stopped right in front of her, his dark, impenetrable eyes softening as they swept over her pale, terrified face. Dominic slowly lowered his massive frame onto the velvet sofa, entirely ignoring the vast empty space in the room to sit mere inches from Clara. He gently pressed one of the cold glasses into her shaking palms, his large, calloused fingers wrapping completely around hers to steady the trembling. Clara looked up at him, entirely paralyzed by his sudden, overwhelming proximity. "Drink," Dominic murmured, his deep, gravelly voice barely above a whisper, entirely stripped of its usual lethal authority. The whiskey burned like liquid fire sliding down her throat, but it anchored her racing heart, forcing the icy panic to recede just a fraction. Dominic stared into his own glass, the amber liquid catching the faint light, before he took a long, heavy swallow. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees, his broad shoulders slouching under the crushing weight of an invisible burden. "I thought I had built an impenetrable fortress," he began, his voice hollow and thick with an old, agonizing grief. "I thought my money and my power could keep the darkness locked outside these gates, but I was wrong." Clara sat perfectly still, too afraid to breathe, as the terrifying monster beside her began to willingly dismantle his own armor. "3 years ago, my enemies realized they could not kill me, so they decided to take the only thing that mattered," Dominic continued, his jaw clenching so hard a muscle feathered in his cheek. "We were leaving a charity gala in the city. It was raining. Lily was strapped into the back seat of my car, laughing at the droplets hitting the window. Her mother, Elena, was sitting right beside her." Dominic closed his eyes, his breathing growing ragged as he dragged himself back into the worst nightmare of his life. "The ambush happened at a red light. 2 vans boxed us in. They opened fire with automatic weapons before my guards could even draw their pieces. Elena threw herself completely over Lily just as the glass shattered." Clara felt a sharp, agonizing ache twist deep in her chest, the horrific parallel to her own actions that very afternoon striking her like a physical blow. "She took 4 bullets to the spine," Dominic whispered, his voice cracking, a raw, devastated sound that completely broke Clara's heart. "I killed every single man in that intersection. I tore them apart with my bare hands, but it was too late. Elena bled to death right there on the leather seats, completely covering our 3-year-old daughter in her blood. Lily did not make a single sound. She just stared at her mother's empty eyes, and she has never spoken another word since that night." Dominic finally turned his head to look at Clara, his dark eyes shimmering with an unspeakable, haunted agony. "I failed to protect my wife. I failed to protect my little girl. I watched my entire world die, and I swore to God I would never let anyone close enough to hurt us again." He reached out, his warm, rough fingertips gently brushing a tear that had slipped down Clara's pale cheek. "And then I found you freezing in an alley, a broken, starving girl who looked like she had nothing left to give, and you threw yourself in front of a gun for my daughter." Dominic slid his hand back to cup the nape of her neck, pulling her gently until her forehead rested against his solid, powerful shoulder. "You are not just a dead anymore, Clara," he breathed into her hair, his massive arms wrapping around her small, fragile frame, completely shielding her from the dark room. "You are the heartbeat of this family now, and I will tear the world apart before I ever let you go." The morning sky over Chicago hung low and gray like a bruised shroud when the blood-stained package arrived at the iron gates of the Vance estate. Clara Hayes stood frozen in the grand foyer, her fingers gripping the edge of the mahogany console table so tightly her knuckles turned bone white. She could not tear her blue-gray eyes away from the gruesome threat lying open on the polished marble floor. It was a pristine white box, and inside rested a shattered porcelain plate from the exact greasy diner where Clara used to scrub dishes, the broken shards completely soaked in dark, dried blood. Pinned to the velvet lining was a photograph of Clara kneeling next to little Lily in the snow, with Clara's face violently crossed out in thick red ink. The crude, terrifying message scrawled across the back promised that the stray alley cat who dared to play house with the untouchable Mafia king would be carved into pieces before the week was over. Dominic Vance stood over the box like a towering monument of pure, unadulterated lethal rage. The air around the ruthless boss grew so suffocatingly cold and heavy that Clara felt her lungs physically seizing in her chest. Dominic did not shout, nor did he smash the fragile antiques lining the walls. Instead, a terrifying, dead silence fell over him, the kind of absolute stillness that only occurs right before a massive, destructive predator strikes. "Lock down the entire perimeter," Dominic murmured, his voice a gravelly, demonic whisper that made the dozen heavily armed guards in the foyer instantly snap into rigid attention. "Nobody enters or leaves without my explicit permission. Put snipers on every roof, sweep the eastern wing, and get my daughter to the underground safe room." As the guards scattered with military precision, their heavy boots thudding against the marble, Dominic slowly turned his dark, impenetrable eyes toward Clara. She was trembling violently, the familiar, crushing panic of the streets threatening to swallow her whole. She had spent 22 years making herself invisible, dodging cruel hands and freezing winds, and now she was the primary target in a brutal underworld war. But before the terror could completely paralyze her, Dominic crossed the foyer in 3 massive strides and pulled her small, shaking frame directly against his broad chest. He smelled of expensive cedar, dark espresso, and the sharp, metallic tang of raw danger. Clara squeezed her eyes shut, instinctively burying her face into his tailored charcoal suit as his heavy, calloused hands wrapped around her fragile shoulders, possessing her completely. He tucked her tightly under his arm, refusing to leave a single inch of space between their bodies as he guided her deeper into the labyrinth of the mansion. The estate was rapidly transforming from a quiet, glittering museum into a heavily fortified bunker. Solid steel shutters lowered over the floor-to-ceiling windows, plunging the opulent hallways into a dim, artificial glow, while men in black tactical gear racked shotguns in the shadows. Every loud click and heavy footstep made Clara flinch, but Dominic's grip on her waist only tightened, anchoring her to the ground. "They think they have found my weakness," Dominic breathed into her ear, his deep voice vibrating against her skin like a physical shield as he pulled her into his private study. "They think they can use you to drag me to my knees, but they have absolutely no idea what kind of monster they just woke up." He pulled back just far enough to cup her pale, terrified face in his large palms, forcing her to meet his burning, obsessive gaze. There was no hesitation in his dark eyes, only a fierce, unconditional possessiveness that completely consumed the freezing air between them. "You are not leaving my sight, Clara," he swore, his thumbs gently tracing her cheekbones. "You will sleep where I sleep, you will breathe the air I breathe, and you will not take a single step in this fortress without me right beside you." Clara swallowed hard, her heart hammering a frantic, undeniable rhythm against her bruised ribs as she stared up at the man who held the entire city in his merciless grip. "Dominic, they are going to come for you because of me," she whispered, her voice cracking under the weight of the gruesome threat. "I am just a street cook. I am not worth starting a war." Dominic's jaw clenched so hard a muscle feathered near his ear, his grip on her face tightening with a desperate, hungry devotion. "You are the only thing in this godforsaken world that is worth a war," he corrected her, his words laced with a dark, romantic finality that made her soul shatter and mend all at once. "I will burn Chicago to the ground, I will turn every street corner to ash, and I will slaughter every breathing soul in that rival syndicate before I ever let a single hand touch one hair on your head." The sheer, terrifying magnitude of his vow wrapped around Clara like a heavy velvet chain, pulling her irrevocably deeper into his dangerous, intoxicating orbit. She was no longer an invisible stray girl fighting for scraps in the cold. She had become the singular, obsessive focus of a man who would gladly destroy the entire world just to keep her safe, and the most frightening part was that she never wanted him to let her go. The underground safe room was a masterpiece of cold steel and reinforced concrete, buried deep beneath the sprawling Vance estate, but tonight it felt as small and fragile as a paper box. High above them, a violent winter thunderstorm raged across Chicago, sending dull, heavy vibrations down through the earth with every deafening crack of thunder. Clara sat rigidly on the edge of the plush leather sofa, pulling her soft cashmere sweater tightly around her shoulders as if the expensive fabric could somehow shield her from the terrifying reality of the Mafia war blazing outside. On the small cot tucked into the far corner of the room, little Lily was finally fast asleep, her small hands clutching a stuffed bunny, oblivious to the heavily armed guards pacing the perimeter above ground. The amber emergency lights cast long, flickering shadows across the bunker, illuminating Dominic Vance as he paced the length of the room like a caged, feral panther. He had discarded his ruined suit jacket hours ago, leaving him in a crisp white shirt with the sleeves rolled up past his elbows, exposing the dark, intricate tattoos and fading scars that mapped his violent past. Every time the muffled roar of thunder shook the thick walls, Clara flinched, her breath hitching in her raw throat, completely unable to shake the gruesome image of the blood-stained package from her mind. For 22 years, she had relied on her sharp street instincts to survive the freezing, merciless alleys, always running at the first sign of danger, always slipping through the cracks of a cruel city that wanted her dead. But now, trapped in a billionaire bunker with a ruthless syndicate hunting her down, there was nowhere left to run. Dominic stopped pacing, his dark, heavy boots making absolutely no sound on the thick rug, and slowly turned his predatory gaze toward her. The air in the confined space instantly thickened, growing so incredibly hot and pressurized that Clara felt her lungs physically struggling to expand. He crossed the room in 3 massive, deliberate strides and lowered his large frame onto the sofa right beside her, the mattress dipping under his sheer, overwhelming weight. He smelled of rain, expensive cedar, and the dark, intoxicating metallic tang of danger. Dominic did not say a single word as he reached out, his large, calloused hands gently capturing her trembling fingers. Clara squeezed her eyes shut, trying desperately to pull back, trying to rebuild the invisible walls that had kept her safely isolated her entire life. But Dominic refused to let her retreat. He smoothly slid his hand up her arm, his touch burning right through the cashmere, until his rough palm cupped the side of her pale, terrified face. His thumb brushed softly across her cheekbone, wiping away a stray tear she had not even realized she shed. "Look at me, Clara," Dominic murmured, his voice a low, gravelly vibration that resonated deep inside her aching chest. Clara opened her blue-gray eyes, instantly colliding with the dark, fathomless depths of his gaze. There was no cold calculation in his expression now, no ruthless mafia king plotting a massacre. There was only a fierce, agonizing vulnerability, a desperate, consuming hunger that mirrored the exact same terrifying emotion tearing through her own battered soul. "You are trembling," he whispered, leaning closer until his hot breath ghosted across her parted lips. "I am scared," Clara breathed, her voice cracking under the crushing weight of the suffocating tension. "I am so scared of what is happening out there." Dominic's jaw clenched so tightly a muscle feathered near his ear, and he tilted her face up, completely consuming her field of vision. "They will never reach you," he swore, his words dripping with dark, absolute devotion. "But I am not talking about the men outside, Clara. You are shaking because of me." She wanted to deny it, to push him away and hide in the safe, numb isolation of her past, but the lie completely dissolved on her tongue. A massive, deafening roll of thunder shook the underground room, and this time, Clara did not flinch away. Instead, a tiny, desperate whimper escaped her throat, and she leaned forward, completely surrendering to the dangerous, gravitational pull of the monster sitting beside her. Dominic let out a ragged, agonizing groan, entirely abandoning his iron control as his mouth crashed down onto hers. The kiss was not gentle. It was a fierce, consuming collision of 2 deeply broken souls, desperate and consuming, tasting of salt, whiskey, and absolute, undeniable surrender. Clara tangled her small, shaking hands into his dark, thick hair, pulling him closer, anchoring herself to the only source of pure warmth she had ever known. Dominic, massive arms wrapped completely around her fragile frame, lifting her effortlessly onto his lap and crushing her against his solid, powerful chest. He kissed her as if she were oxygen and he had been suffocating in a pitch-black ocean for his entire life. Clara felt the last, stubborn pieces of her street-hardened armor completely shatter and fall away. She was kissing a ruthless killer, a man who commanded a dark, bloody underworld, but as his lips moved passionately against hers, she realized with terrifying, undeniable clarity that she was hopelessly, irrevocably in love with him. Dominic broke the kiss just long enough to press his forehead against hers, both of them gasping for air in the dim, golden light. He stared into her wide, tear-filled eyes, realizing that this fragile, unbroken street chef was the only true, radiant light in his entire, suffocating universe. "You are my absolute everything," Dominic whispered fiercely against her swollen lips, permanently binding their fates together in the dark. "And I will burn the whole world down to keep you." The morning after the storm felt deceptively quiet, a brittle calm that settled over the sprawling estate like a thin layer of ice. Dominic had been summoned to a neutral territory for a forced peace negotiation arranged by the older, supposedly impartial syndicates of Chicago. He had fought the summons with every ounce of his lethal rage, his dark eyes burning with absolute refusal to leave Clara and little Lily alone, but a direct order from the High Commission was the one thing even he could not openly ignore without triggering an all-out street war. Before he left, he had pressed a desperate, bruising kiss to Clara's lips, surrounding the mansion with 36 of his most elite, heavily armed men and swearing he would return before nightfall. But the peace meeting was a carefully orchestrated lie. Barely 2 hours after Dominic's black armored car disappeared through the iron gates, the impenetrable fortress was violently shattered. It started with a deafening explosion that ripped through the eastern wing, shaking the marble floors and sending a terrifying shockwave of heat through the grand hallways. Gunfire erupted instantly, a rapid, mechanical staccato of death that echoed through the pristine corridors. Clara was in the sunroom reading to Lily when the glass windows suddenly imploded. Survival instincts forged on the brutal streets took over before she could even think. She grabbed the terrified little girl, shoving her deeply into the hidden, reinforced panic space beneath the floorboards, pressing a desperate finger to her own lips. "Stay completely quiet." "Sweet angel," Clara whispered, pulling the heavy Persian rug over the trapdoor just as heavy combat boots kicked the mahogany doors completely off their hinges. 5 masked men in dark tactical gear swarmed the room, their suppressed weapons raised and searching. Clara did not scream or beg. She backed away from the hidden door, drawing their entire, lethal attention toward herself. One of the massive intruders lunged forward, the heavy steel butt of his rifle coming down hard against the side of her head. A brilliant flash of white-hot pain exploded behind her eyes, and the opulent world dissolved into a sickening, spinning darkness. When Clara finally drifted back to consciousness, the warm, cashmere-scented safety of the mansion had been replaced by a freezing, damp nightmare. She was tied rigidly to a rusted metal chair in the center of a cavernous, decaying warehouse that smelled heavily of toxic black mold, stale ocean water, and ancient copper. The bitter Chicago wind howled through broken, jagged skylights, biting mercilessly through her thin sweater and chilling her straight to the bone. Her head throbbed with a blinding, relentless agony, and the thick, metallic taste of blood coated her dry tongue. Heavy, deliberate footsteps echoed against the wet concrete, approaching from the dense shadows. A man stepped into the harsh, flickering halo of a single overhead bulb, his face severely scarred and his eyes flat, completely devoid of any human empathy. He was the ruthless head of the rival syndicate, the very monster who had ordered the hit on Dominic's wife 3 years ago. "So this is the little stray cat that has the great Dominic Vance acting like a rabid dog," the man sneered, grabbing Clara by the jaw and forcing her to look at him. His thick fingers dug painfully into her bruised skin, his breath smelling of stale smoke and rot. "You are going to tell me exactly how many guards patrol his underground bunker, and you are going to tell me exactly where he hides his mute little brat." Clara stared up into the dead, shark-like eyes of the monster, her body shivering violently from the freezing temperature, but her spirit remained utterly unbreakable. The streets had taught her that weakness only invited more cruelty, and her fierce, undeniable love for Dominic and Lily burned inside her chest like a protective, raging furnace. "I do not know anything," Clara rasped, her voice rough but entirely steady. The man laughed, a crude, hollow sound, before his heavy hand swung back and struck her across the face with terrifying, brutal force. The impact snapped her head to the side, splitting her lower lip wide open and sending fresh, hot blood trickling down her pale chin. The pain was blinding, a sharp, agonizing fire that radiated through her fractured skull, but Clara simply turned her face back to him, lifting her chin with stubborn, fierce defiance. She bit down hard on her bleeding lip, swallowing the copper taste of her own blood, and locked her blue-gray eyes with his. She thought of Dominic's warm, calloused hands, of the way his massive chest felt against her cheek, of Lily's fragile, trusting smile, and she anchored her entire soul to them. They hit her again, harder this time, the rusted chair violently rattling against the damp concrete floor. Clara gasped for air, her ribs aching, her vision swimming with dark, fuzzy spots, but she did not shed a single tear. Let them hit her. Let them break her fragile bones. She had survived 22 years of being beaten, discarded, and starved by a city that wanted her dead. She would rather let these monsters tear her apart piece by bloody piece than ever betray the only true family she had ever known. She sat in the freezing darkness, bleeding and broken, waiting for the devil she loved to burn the world down and find her. The freezing air of the abandoned warehouse felt like crushed glass against Clara's pale skin, but the agonizing pain only sharpened her feral survival instincts. The rival syndicate boss paced in front of her, his heavy leather boots splashing through toxic puddles of stagnant water, completely unaware that the fragile street chef tied to the rusted metal chair was already quietly sawing through her thick nylon restraints. Clara had spent 22 years navigating the brutal, merciless alleys of Chicago, learning exactly how to turn discarded scraps into weapons and sheer terror into pure adrenaline. While her captors laughed and mocked the great Dominic Vance, assuming the dangerous Mafia boss was safely contained at their fake peace summit across town, Clara systematically worked a jagged, rusted nail she had secretly pried from the chair back against the thick bindings around her wrists. Blood slicked her palms, warm and slippery against the cold metal, but she did not let out a single sound, keeping her blue-gray eyes fixed on the filthy concrete floor to completely mask her burning defiance. She thought of little Lily, of the sweet, traumatized child who had finally found a safe voice through silent gestures, and she thought of Dominic, the terrifying, obsessive monster who had wrapped her in soft cashmere and absolute safety. The thick nylon rope finally snapped with a dull pop, leaving her hands completely free just as the rival boss turned back toward her with a cruel, rotten smile. He reached into his dark coat to pull a weapon, but Clara exploded upward from the metal chair with the desperate, blinding ferocity of a cornered alley cat. She threw her entire body weight forward, driving her bruised shoulder directly into the man's chest and sending him crashing backward into a mountain of decaying wooden crates. Clara did not wait to watch him fall. She spun on her heel, her bare, bleeding feet slapping against the frozen concrete as she sprinted wildly toward the heavy steel loading doors at the far end of the pitch-black warehouse. 2 armed guards at the perimeter raised their automatic rifles, shouting crude, violent commands, but their harsh voices were instantly drowned out by a deafening, earth-shattering explosion. The massive, reinforced steel doors of the warehouse blew entirely off their heavy hinges, twisting and screaming as they crashed into the flooded floor in a blinding shower of golden sparks and thick gray smoke. Through the dense, suffocating cloud of destruction stepped Dominic Vance, looking less like a mortal man and more like a mythical, blood-soaked god of pure, unadulterated vengeance. His expensive charcoal suit was completely ruined, soaked in the fresh crimson blood of the men he had slaughtered across the entire city to find her, and his dark, predatory eyes burned with a lethal, obsessive fire that made the remaining syndicate thugs freeze in absolute, primal terror. Dominic did not hesitate for a single second. He raised his heavy weapons and marched forward like a harbinger of absolute death, unleashing a deafening, relentless storm of bullets that shattered every pane of glass in the vaulted ceiling and dropped his enemies to the wet concrete before they could even pull their triggers. The cold air grew suffocatingly thick with the acrid smell of burning gunpowder and the horrifying sounds of his absolute retribution, but Clara could not hear anything over the frantic, overwhelming hammering of her own heart. She stopped running, falling to her knees among the glittering shards of broken glass, her breath hitching painfully in her raw throat as the chaotic gunfire abruptly ceased. The cavernous warehouse plunged into a heavy, metallic silence, broken only by the terrifying sound of Dominic's heavy boots crunching over the shattered remnants of his vanquished enemies. He dropped his smoking weapons to the wet floor, completely ignoring the brutal carnage he had just orchestrated, and fell to his knees right in front of her. His large, shaking hands reached out, hovering over her pale, bruised face and her split, bleeding lip as if he were absolutely terrified that touching her might break her fragile bones. "You are alive," Dominic choked out, his deep, gravelly voice cracking with an emotion so raw and desperate it completely shattered his ruthless, untouchable Mafia crown. Clara let out a broken, tearful sob and threw her small, trembling body directly into his massive chest, burying her face deeply into his blood-soaked shirt without a single ounce of fear. Dominic wrapped his thick, corded arms tightly around her fragile frame, crushing her against him with a fierce, unconditional possessiveness that permanently shielded her from the horrors of the entire world. He buried his face in her dark, tangled hair, breathing her in like she was his only source of oxygen, his heavy, racing heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her bruised cheek. "I swore I would burn the entire city to ashes before I let them take you from me," Dominic whispered fiercely into the quiet, frozen darkness, rocking her gently amidst the bloody ruins of his enemies. "And I will slaughter absolutely anyone who ever tries to look at you again, Clara, because you are mine, and I am never, ever letting you go." The heavy scent of expensive cedar and clean linen wrapped around Clara before she even opened her eyes. She was sinking into a mattress so incredibly thick and soft it felt like floating on a warm cloud, a stark, jarring contrast to the freezing, mold-infested concrete floor of the warehouse. Slowly, painfully, she blinked against the dim, golden light filtering through the heavy blackout curtains of the master bedroom. Her entire body ached with a dull, throbbing rhythm, every single breath pulling at her bruised ribs, but beneath the physical pain, there was a profound, unshakable stillness. She was alive. She was safe. She turned her head against the silk pillowcase, wincing slightly as the movement tugged at the bandages carefully taped along her jaw and shoulder. Beside the massive, sprawling bed, bathed in the soft glow of a single amber reading lamp, sat Dominic Vance. The ruthless, untouchable Mafia king of Chicago looked entirely shattered. He had discarded his ruined, blood-soaked suit from the night before, now wearing only a simple, dark gray shirt that stretched tightly across his broad, heavily tattooed chest. He was slumped in a plush armchair, his elbows resting heavily on his knees and his face buried deep in his large, calloused hands. The sheer exhaustion rolling off his massive frame was palpable, stripping away the terrifying, lethal aura he usually carried like a heavy iron crown. Clara watched the steady, ragged rise and fall of his shoulders, her heart swelling with an emotion so fierce and consuming it left her completely breathless. For 22 years, she had been nothing but a ghost in this cruel city, an invisible, discarded street girl surviving on scraps, patching her worn-out shoes with tape and hiding from the merciless winter winds. She had never mattered to anyone, never been searched for, never been fought for. But this man, this incredibly dangerous, violent predator who controlled the entire criminal underworld, had literally torn the city apart piece by bloody piece just to bring her back. Clara swallowed past the dry, scratchy lump in her throat and reached out, her small, pale hand trembling as it stretched across the vast expanse of the mattress. Her fingertips brushed the edge of his dark sleeve. Dominic flinched violently, his head snapping up with the terrifying speed of a cornered beast, but the second his dark, bloodshot eyes locked onto her open ones, the feral danger instantly vanished. A ragged, completely broken sound tore from his chest. He slipped out of the armchair, dropping heavily to his knees directly onto the thick carpet beside her side of the bed. He did not care about his pride, did not care about his status or his power. He reached out, his massive, shaking hands hovering over her bruised face as if she were made of spun glass, and he was terrified of shattering her all over again. "You are awake," Dominic whispered, his deep, gravelly voice cracking under the crushing weight of his absolute relief. "I am here," Clara breathed, turning her face just enough to press her soft, bruised cheek directly into his rough palm. The contact was electric, grounding her to the birth. Dominic squeezed his eyes shut, a single, silent tear escaping to track down the sharp, harsh lines of his jaw. He leaned forward, burying his face in a crook of her neck, inhaling her set like a man who had been suffocating underwater for a lifetime. "I thought I lost you," he murmured against her skin, his large body physically trembling. "When I saw you tied to that chair, covered in blood. I have never known terror like that, Clara. Never." Clara slowly tangled her fingers into his thick, dark hair, holding him close, anchoring the monster who had become her ultimate protector. "They could not break me," she promised, her voice steady and fierce. "I kept thinking of you, and I kept thinking of Lily, and I knew I had to survive." Dominic pulled back just enough to look at her, his dark eyes burning with a consuming, possessive fire that completely devoured her soul. He smoothly slid his hand up to cup the back of her head, gently pulling her forward until he could press his forehead firmly against hers. The entire, chaotic world outside the impenetrable walls of the Vance estate completely faded away. "You saved my daughter," Dominic vowed, the words vibrating deeply between them. "You saved my entire universe, Clara. I am completely, irrevocably yours." He moved his thumb softly over her lower lip, his gaze dropping to her mouth with an aching, desperate hunger. "There is no more running. There is no more hiding in the shadows. You are the heart of this family now, and I swear on my life, I will burn down anyone who ever tries to make you feel invisible again." Clara let out a soft, tearful laugh, finally completely surrendering to the overwhelming, undeniable truth. She was not astray anymore. She was loved by a monster, and she loved him right back. She closed the tiny gap between them, pressing her lips against his in a slow, sweet, and deeply healing kiss that permanently sealed their fates together in the dark. The heavy oak door to the bedroom clicked open with a soft, tiny sound. Dominic broke the kiss but did not move away, wrapping his thick arms securely around Clara as they both looked toward the entrance. Little Lily stood there in her pink pajamas, clutching her stuffed bunny tightly against her chest, her big brown eyes wide and fearful. But the moment the little girl saw Clara sitting up and smiling, the fear completely melted away. Lily ran across the plush carpet, her bare feet making no sound, and scrambled carefully up onto the edge of the massive bed. She crawled right into Clara's waiting arms, burying her small face against Clara's uninjured shoulder. Dominic shifted his weight, wrapping his other massive arm around his daughter, pulling both of his girls into a tight, impenetrable embrace. Clara rested her chin on Lily's soft, dark hair, leaning her head perfectly against Dominic's solid shoulder. The heavy, suffocating silence that had always defined the Vance estate was gone, replaced by the steady, synchronized beating of three distinct hearts. Clara looked at the formidable, dangerous man holding her, and then at the precious little girl clinging to her sweater, and she knew with absolute, unshakable certainty that she had finally found her home. She was the queen of this dark, beautiful empire, and she would never be cold or invisible again. 6 months later, the bitter Chicago winter had finally surrendered to a soft, golden spring, and the once suffocating silence of the Vance estate had been permanently broken. Clara stood perfectly still before the towering floor-to-ceiling mirrors of the master bedroom, smoothing her hands over the heavy, midnight blue silk of her designer gown. She was no longer the invisible, shivering street chef who patched her worn-out shoes with duct tape to survive the freezing, merciless alleys. Around her slender throat rested a breathtaking collar of flawless diamonds, a heavy, glittering weight that perfectly matched the magnificent wedding band on her left hand, but the true symbol of her incredible transformation was the absolute, unshakable confidence radiating from her blue-gray eyes. The heavy mahogany door clicked open, and little Lily bounded into the opulent room, wearing a matching dark blue dress and a pair of shiny silver shoes. The dark, terrified shadows that had once haunted the little girl's bright brown eyes were entirely gone, replaced by a radiant, innocent joy that filled the cavernous space with pure warmth. "You look exactly like a queen, Mama," Lily said, her small voice clear and melodic, punctuating the spoken words with fluid, graceful sign language. Clara felt her chest swell with an overwhelming, consuming love, dropping gracefully to her knees to gather the precious child into her arms. "And you look like a beautiful princess, my sweet angel," Clara whispered, pressing a tender, lingering kiss to Lily's soft cheek. Heavy, deliberate footsteps echoed against the marble floor of the grand hallway, and Dominic stepped into the doorway, completely filling the frame with his massive, imposing presence. He wore a perfectly tailored black tuxedo that highlighted his broad, powerful shoulders, his dark hair swept back, and his lethal, predatory grace commanding the very air around him. The ruthless Mafia boss, the feared king of the Chicago underworld who could make entire crime syndicates tremble and beg with a single, cold glance, stopped dead in his tracks. His dark, fathomless eyes swept over Clara and Lily, and a dangerous, icy mask he wore for the rest of the brutal world instantly melted into a look of absolute, worshipful devotion. He crossed the thick Persian rug in 3 long strides, sinking to one knee beside them regardless of his expensive tailored suit. His large, calloused hands cupped Clara's delicate face, his thumbs gently brushing her cheekbones before he leaned in to press a deep, reverent kiss to her parted lips. He tasted of expensive whiskey, clean cedar, and the fierce, protective fire that had burned down an entire rival syndicate just to keep her safely in his arms. "You absolutely take my breath away," Dominic murmured against her mouth, his voice a low, gravelly vibration that sent a familiar, thrilling shiver straight down her spine. He pulled back just enough to kiss the top of Lily's dark head, wrapping his thick, heavily tattooed arms around both of them in a fierce, unbreakable embrace. "My entire world, right here in my arms," he declared, resting his heavy chin on Clara's shoulder. Later that evening, the grand ballroom of the sprawling estate was filled with the most powerful, dangerous men and women in the city, an opulent gathering of the elite and the bloody underworld combined. But when Dominic led Clara down the sweeping marble staircase with Lily holding tightly to her other hand, the entire cavernous room fell into a sudden, breathless silence. The whispered, legendary rumors of the fierce, unbroken street girl who had thrown her own fragile body into the line of fire for the boss daughter had spread like absolute wildfire. Now, seeing Clara standing tall, radiant, and completely unafraid beside the absolute ruler of the city, the hardened criminals did not look at her with pity or dismissal. They lowered their heads in genuine, profound respect. Dominic kept his large, warm hand firmly resting at the small of her back, a silent, lethal promise to every single person in the room that the beautiful woman beside him was permanently untouchable. Clara looked up at her powerful husband, tracing the faded silver scar near his eye with a loving gaze, and she realized that she had never truly been broken by the cruel streets. She had simply been waiting for the beautiful monster who would recognize her true worth. They were a family forged in blood, broken glass, and unimaginable trauma, but they had built an empire of fierce, unconditional love that no one would ever be able to tear apart. Clara smiled brightly as Dominic pulled her onto the polished dance floor, spinning her gently under the glittering crystal chandeliers, her weary heart finally completely at peace. Thank you so much for listening to this incredible story on Sunni romance, where we bring you the most intense and emotional tales of love and survival. Did you love seeing Clara and Dominic finally get their beautiful happily ever after, and what kind of fierce protector romance do you want to hear next? Let us know in the comments below, and please do not forget to like, subscribe, and share this video with someone who loves a thrilling mafia romance. Until next time, stay safe and keep believing in the absolute power of a love that can conquer the darkest of worlds.